It was a cool night. Not cold like my ex-wife's heart, but cool, like a Sam Cooke record. The name's Professor Victor, and I investigate the most essential, noteworthy, interesting, and notorious modern horror films. My latest case was quite a doozy, looking at retro, period-style, throwback horror films. I felt like I was onto something intriguing, but it bore more investigation. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Horror Movie Syllabus. My name is Professor Victor, and I'll be your host as we go through all of the essential, noteworthy, interesting, and downright notorious modern horror films. If you're new to the syllabus, I recommend you check out our introduction video. There's a link to that in the description below, and it'll give you a pretty good explanation of what the Horror Movie Syllabus is all about. But in short, what we're going to do is take a look at a particular subgenre of horror and look at 3 representative movies from that subgenre. Today, the subgenre that we're looking at is throwback horror. And when I say throwback horror, what we're really talking about are movies that have kind of a vintage or retro style to them. They look like they were made in another time period. And this is generally by design. It's generally an homage or an intentional attempt to evoke the look and style and feel of an older movie, usually something from the 70s or 80s. And it's a cool idea. It's a cool way to give a fresh look or an interesting spin on what might be an otherwise, ordinary tale. I really like these kind of movies. I like when a filmmaker goes to great lengths to basically capture a mood, feeling, and look from an earlier time. Yes, it plays off our nostalgia quite a bit, and I think that's perfectly fine. We've talked a lot about nostalgia here at the Horror Movie Syllabus and how that can really tap into whether or not we like a movie. So I'm kind of fine with a director using that as a tool to kind of ingratiate his audience into the film. But I also just think it's neat to see somebody take on the challenge of using older filming techniques or older filming equipment in some cases to take a modern spin on an older look or an older generation of film. I think that's pretty neat, and I find these to be pretty interesting films, at least visually to look at, if not always narratively speaking. But even narratively speaking, I think it's oftentimes interesting to see them take a more modern take on an older concept or trope. And I think a lot of the movies we talk about today are doing that. It's worth noting that when we talk about throwback horror, often we're not really talking about period pieces per se. We're not necessarily talking about stories set in an earlier time period. Sometimes that'll be the case, and some of the movies that we talk about today actually are set in an earlier time period. But oftentimes when we're talking about throwback horror or retro horror, what we're talking about are movies that are in a modern setting or modern time period or current time period, but are shot or made or evoke an earlier time period. They are shot kind of 70s Grindhouse style, for example, and you'll see what I'm talking about when we talk about the movies in just a minute. But I do like that quite a bit. I like that kind of almost anachronistic feeling of a modern setting or a modern story being set, 20, 30, 40 years into the past, or at least filmed like it was shot 20, 30, 40 years into the past. I think that's neat. I think that adds that layer of interest to a movie, even if the story isn't, like I said, isn't revolutionary or isn't really mind-blowingly unique or exciting. Having that film technique, having that throwback style adds that layer of interest to it that'll keep me engaged, even if the story is, maybe less than what I'd want it to be. That said, the movies that we're going to talk about today generally, by and large, have good to great stories. I don't want to oversell the narratives of these movies because sometimes they are a little thin, but they're not bad by any stretch of the imagination. It's just that the throwback style enhances the film. It makes it more noteworthy, more interesting, and frankly worth watching and talking about. As you can probably tell, I tend to really like these throwback horror movies. I find them charming. I find them interesting. I find them fun. And as a result, that's how we're organizing today's movies. As usual, we're going to put them in undergraduate, graduate, and postgraduate level order. And in this case, they're in the order of how much I like them. So with that, let's get back in time and go look at these movies. Sorry. The first movie that we're going to talk about today, the undergraduate level selection, is The Devil's Rejects. The Devil's Rejects came out in 2005 and is directed by notorious filmmaker Rob Zombie, who tends to be a rather divisive figure in horror, and we'll talk about him a little bit more in a minute. But if you have not seen the movie operates as a sequel to Rob Zombie's House of a Thousand Corpses and picks up where that movie left off with the Firefly family, the villains in the first movie, on the run from the police. They are being pursued by an obsessive cop whose brother was killed in the first movie, and he'll stop at nothing to catch these criminals and make them suffer for what they've done. Meanwhile, they're on a murderous rampage, and that's where we'll leave it at that. We don't want to spoil the movie, of course, but it's a wild ride. Rob Zombie is somewhat notorious for making extremely violent and grim movies, and The Devil's Rejects is no exception to that rule. In fact, it might be one of the biggest examples of it, frankly. Opinions may vary on that issue, but The Devil's Reject is a very, very violent film. What's interesting is, as I noted, it's a sequel to House of a Thousand Corpses, which in itself is quite graphic and violent too. But while House of a Thousand Corpses had almost, I don't want to say a cartoonish quality, but it was kind of like an insane fever dream. It had kind of almost a surreal quality to it. The Devil's Rejects goes in a different direction. It's very real and gritty and grimy, and that's a part of what makes it, I think, a much more impactful and a better film. But B, also makes it the throwback film that it is. Rob Zombie filmed this movie as if it was a 70s exploitation flick, like a 70s Grindhouse style flick. It has all that same kind of that handheld grimy style, and like it looks like it's lived in and kind of dirty and lower budget, and it's hard to describe exactly, but you kind of know what I mean. If you've seen those old movies from the 70s, those Grindhouse exploitation movies, they're really kind of grimy and low budget and violent and not polished, and The Devil's Rejects really does capture that aesthetic intentionally. Rob Zombie was going for that. He's got maybe an obsession, at least a fascination with the 1970s and 70s style filmmaking, and it's on full display in Devil's Rejects, and to good effect. It really gives the movie, again, that extra layer of interest to me. I like those old movies from the 70s. I find them great. I enjoy them very much, and so seeing that throwback style, that retro style, was very appealing to me and made me like this movie a lot more than House of a Thousand Corpses, which I found to be fine. It was fun, but it was just kind of weird to me. This one was more of a straight up revenge flick, crime spree road movie, in the best possible way. Now, what's interesting about it is when I first saw this movie, I saw a bootleg copy of it. It wasn't the best bootleg copy of it. And that actually added to a lot of the aesthetic for me because it wasn't the best copy. Bootleg, it was a bootleg copy. It was not the cleanest. It looked even more grimy and cheap and low budget and grindhousey. And that just added to the experience. So it was funny. The first time I saw it that way. And then when I saw it again, I saw it on DVD in a nice clean copy. I was surprised that it actually looked better than I thought it did, and a little bit better than I thought it should. Like, Zombie's still using mostly modern equipment, and the images are cleaner than you would get in a Grindhouse movie. He didn't go all the way and use old film and scratch it up and things like that. But he still captured not only the look but the spirit of those 70s movies, and he does it very, very well. A big part of the success of the movie has to do with the cast, which includes the legendary Sid Haig, who unfortunately passed away, but I got to meet him at a convention before he did, so that's great. Bill Moseley, who's pretty famous genre actor. Everybody knows him. If you're a horror fan, you know Bill Moseley. And of course the omnipresent Sherry Moon Zombie, Rob Zombie's wife, who appears in pretty much every one of his movies. I think every single one of his movies. And then of course a lot of other noteworthy actors show up in there. Danny Trejo, Ken Foree. There's a lot of other genre actors that show up in there that give extra cred to the movie for horror fans, and I appreciated that. And they give good performances too. There's a good chemistry between them, and they don't hold back. This is a movie that I don't think I'd go so far as to call it like one of the extreme horror movies, but it's pretty rough ride. It's a pretty intense movie that doesn't really pull its punches. This is a violent family on the run and a violent cop chasing them. And it goes to some really dark places. It's a little bit depraved, a little bit unsettling. So be forewarned about that. But I did appreciate that Zombie kind of went there. He took that 70s grindhouse exploitation style and notched it up like to 11. It really didn't want to hold back any punches. Just really wanted to give us that gut punch that those old movies tend to do, especially by modern sensibilities. You watch an old movie from the 70s now, you're like shocked by the level of violence in it. And I think that's what Zombie was going for, and I think he succeeded. Now, aside from using more modern equipment and it being a little bit cleaner of an image, he also has a really great 70s rock soundtrack that, quite frankly, most of the movies made in the 70s in those grindhouse exploitation days wouldn't have been able to afford. They wouldn't have been able to license that music, probably. So that's another thing that maybe kind of takes it out of the throwback style. It kind of diminishes that retro aspect a little bit. But I'm nitpicking because those 70s tunes just kind of tap into that nostalgia that I was talking about. It really gives you that feeling of being back in the 70s, for those of us that were alive in the 70s, or even if you weren't. You know enough about the 70s from a kind of a high level, pop culture understanding of it, that you'll still get that feeling, that it'll still evoke that 70s feel to you. So Rob Zombie was successful in this one. I know that he is not the most beloved of horror directors. He tends to be rather divisive. He's got his diehard fans, and he's got people who just absolutely can't stand him. I fall somewhere in the middle. I've liked several of his movies. I haven't seen all of them. I don't worship at the altar of Rob Zombie, but I also appreciate that he has a pretty good eye, and he gives a he's a well, I don't think he's the most creative director. I think he tends to go to the same well one too many times. He does that well. He stays in his lane pretty well. I know that he's slated to direct the Munsters movie coming up pretty soon, and I'm very curious to see how that goes, because that's very much out of his lane. And when he stays in his lane, I think he does a good job. But it'll be interesting to see him stretch. I'm open minded to seeing him stretch, and but I know not everybody loves him. I know a lot of that has to do with his take on Halloween. We will be talking about that in the future, and it'll be an interesting conversation, but that's for another time. For now, let me just sum up by saying that I really enjoyed The Devil's Rejects. I think it's a fun film. I think it's well made. I appreciate that 70s aesthetic. I do think it's better than House of a Thousand Corpses. I do think it's probably one of Zombie's better films. That may be a low bar to some people, but I do think it's one of his better films. If you haven't seen it, if you're into that kind of movie, if you're into the 70s exploitation, kind of violent stuff, this one might be for you. If it's not your bag, this movie's not going to change your mind on it. If you don't like those kind of movies, nothing here for you. You can skip it. But if you like that kind of movie, check it out. Let me know what you think, because I think that it's pretty cool, but I know not everybody shares that opinion. And if you have the differing opinion, share that in the comments below too. I'd like to have the counterpoint represented in the comments for people who haven't seen it. So if you have no love for Zombie or no love for Devil's Rejects, or if you think House of a Thousand Corpses is better, let us know in the comments below. But otherwise, I'm looking forward to seeing what you guys have to say in the comments. The next movie that we're talking about today, the graduate level selection, is The Love Witch. The Love Witch came out in 2016. It's a rather recent movie. And when it came out, it kind of set the horror world on fire. It got a lot of buzz when it came out. And I'd say that buzz was well warranted. It was for good reason. If you're not familiar with the movie, it's basically the story about a young witch who is looking for love, looking for companionship, and using witch spells to try to get that love. And the spells tend to not work out tremendously well. They tend to backfire, as spells do in horror movies. And of course, she has to deal with the fallout from those broken spells. And we'll leave it at that. Of course, I don't want to get too much into the details because, as usual, I don't want to spoil things for you. But The Love Witch was a movie that I got to a little later than the buzz. And so I had some pretty high expectations going into it. And I'd say those expectations were met. It delivered exactly what I was expecting it to deliver. The main reason there was a lot of hype or buzz around the movie is because the movie was shot with this 60s aesthetic. It was supposed to be like a retro throwback to the 60s Technicolor style of filming, with the 35 millimeter film and the Technicolor colors and the lighting, the soft lighting, and the kind of almost melodramatic dialogue or delivery of the dialogue, and it nails this. It really does. If you've ever seen those movies, like the later Hammer movies, or even just like kind of the '60s musicals or romance movies, even some of the '60s TV, you'll recognize this style. You'll understand the soft lighting for the women and the kind of almost stilted dialogue and delivery of it. That it's got this tremendous charm to it, and I just ate it up with a spoon. It really hit the sweet spot for me. I have no shame in telling you that I was not born in the '60s. It's something that I didn't grow up with it, so it's not like I remember the '60s firsthand. But when I was growing up, I was born in the '70s, so when I was growing up, a lot of that stuff was still permeating, television and movies and stuff like that. So that aesthetic was carrying over quite a bit. So it's very familiar to me. Plus, I have an affinity for older movies, so I tend to love this stuff. And the slavish attention to detail in this movie, in terms of recreating the '60s aesthetic, the '60s style of filming, both in terms of the technical aspect with like the 35 millimeter film and the coloring, and also again the acting and the camera angles and editing. It all really is. Again, it's a hyper real version of the '60s. I imagine if you put the Love Witch up against an actual '60s movie, Technicolor Dream movie, you would see that the Love Witch is like a hyper real version of it. It's like, it's like when people do an impression, it's like they accentuate like the most obvious aspects of it. It's not really like an impersonation of somebody. It's not accurate. It's like hyperbole. It's like blown up, and that's what the Love Witch is. It's like a hyperbolic version of a 1960s movies, and I love it. I think it's absolutely great, and I'm not alone because it was quite a buzz hit and a cult favorite. It was directed by a woman named Anna Biller, and she didn't just direct it; she wrote it, she directed it, she edited it, she shot it, she scored it, she produced it. Like, she did it all, and my tip of the hat to her. Absolutely fantastic job behind the camera and producing this movie. I'm looking forward to getting into her filmography and seeing what else she's done or what else she's going to do, because she really knocked it out of the park with this one. And as you see, I'm talking a lot about the style because the story itself is thin. It's a movie about a young witch trying to find love, and she's not super malicious, but these spells tend to go wrong, and they go wrong with really disastrous results. And again, I don't want to spoil the details for you, but her drive for love doesn't stop her from causing harm. Like, she's aware that things are going wrong, but she doesn't stop. And the reason why that works is because of the actress playing the Love Witch, Samantha Robinson, who gives a fantastic performance. She's so charming and watchable. Every time she's on screen, she's just captivating. You can't take your eyes off her. She has nailed that '60s style to a T. The delivery of her lines, the way she walks, the way she moves, she seems like a person out of place. And that's key because this movie is not set in the 1960s. But Samantha Robinson's character feels like she's in the 1960s, even though everything else in the movie is modern. She feels like she's almost transported from another time period. Even her attitude, her beliefs, her patriarchal ideas really seem out of place and out of time in this movie, and that's a big part of what adds to the fun of the movie. If this movie had just been set in modern times, or even a period piece, and just played straight without the throwback style, it would be fine. It's a compelling enough story, it would be fine. Where the real fun comes is having this throwback style. Having Samantha Robinson look like she's out of the 1960s, sound like she's not out of the 1960s, act like she's out of the 1960s, and then everybody else kind of reacting to that and being kind of under her spell, both literally in the movie's narrative and also figuratively in the sense of like just how charming she is. And the movie's she's very sexy in the movie, and the movie's got a lot of sex appeal in a 1960s style. There's nudity in the movie, but it's not smutty nudity. It's not like 80s style gratuitous nudity. It's like it's 60s charming nudity, if that makes any kind of sense. And Samantha Robinson, who's not doing a tremendous lot of nudity, but she's in a lot of sexy outfits and stuff like that. It really ties into that '60s charm of like pinup girl type stuff, and not pinup so much because that's more '50s, but kind of what I'm talking about. With the hair and the lingerie and stuff like that. She really seems like she's out of another time period, and of course all the characters reacting to her are reacting to that aspect of it, and it works extremely well. Now, what's fun about that is Anna Biller has kind of subverted certain themes by doing it this way. She's making commentary, at least from my perspective, she's making commentary on modern feminism versus traditional patriarchal family structures, if you will, because the Love Witch is you know old fashioned, if you will. She's looking for a man who's going to be the man, and she eschews like men who aren't manly. There's one guy in there that she just doesn't feel as manly enough because he's very emotional. He's kind of a modern day sensitive man, and she's not having that. And it's kind of fun to see that perspective from the character, and then see it directly conflict with modern sensibilities and modern notions of things like feminism, but without hitting you over the head with it. It's not a big message movie. It's not a big feminist movie. It's not trying to hammer you over the head with some sort of political agenda or anything like that. It's just an interesting juxtaposition, seeing somebody out of time eschewing older values or ideas and how they both do and do not fit in modern times. It's just fun. It's a fun little extra layer to the movie that you don't even necessarily have to pick up on, but if you do, I think it adds something deeper to the movie. The movie has a lot of charm and has that cool aesthetic, but I feel like there's an undercurrent layer that makes it feel deeper than it might seem. Or perhaps I'm just reading too much into it. Perhaps I just like this movie a lot and I'm trying to give it more weight, and maybe it's not. Maybe it's more surface level than I'm saying. But I feel like there's that deeper level in there. I feel like there's a bit of a tongue-in-cheek wink and a nod at old-fashioned ideas and modern ideas at the same time. It's kind of poking at both of them a little bit, kind of being a little cheeky on both of them, and I appreciated that. I think it's great. Anna Biller knocked it out of the park. Samantha Robinson knocked it out of the park. The movie is a lot of fun. If you haven't seen The Love Witch, do yourself a favor, give it a chance, check it out. If you like older movies, if you have an affinity for especially movies of the 1960s, I think you'll dig this movie quite a bit. I think that this will hit you right in the sweet spot. But if it's not for you, even if you don't have that affinity for older movies, maybe give it a chance anyways. Because again, it's just charming. The performance of Samantha Robinson alone might be enough to draw you in and win you over. So Love Witch is a recommend from me. By all means, check it out. The last movie we're talking about today, the postgraduate level selection, is House of the Devil. House of the Devil came out in 2009, and it's directed by Ty West, who I've talked about on the channel a couple of times before. And I think he might be one of my favorite directors, at least one of my favorite horror directors, because the guy keeps making excellent movies, and House of the Devil is no exception. If you're not familiar with it, the story is about a young college girl who needs a little extra money, and so she takes a babysitting gig that gets advertised, goes to a mysterious, kind of creepy house, and meets a strange family who informs her that she's not there to babysit a child, but rather an old woman who's kind of ill. They're a little bit strange, but she wants the money. They're paying her extremely well, so she takes the job, and hijinks abound. And we won't go too much into it beyond that because we don't want to spoil it, although we might kind of tip a little bit of our hand talking about this movie just a little bit. Now, unlike the previous two movies that we discussed already, this movie actually is a period piece. It's set in the early 80s, and you can tell from the styles of the haircuts and some of the technology and stuff in there. But they don't make a big deal of it. It's not like Stranger Things, where it's like, this is the 80s. It's just kind of subtly set in the 80s, and if you lived in the 80s, you'll pick up on that right away. And even if you didn't, you probably can tell pretty easily. But not only is it set in the 80s, it's filmed like it was filmed in the 80s, late 70s, early 80s. The titles, the opening titles, opening credits, the camera work, the using of the 16 millimeter film. The whole aesthetic is like an old film movie. And just like in Love Witch, they crush it. Ty West really, I mean, I've talked about him before. He has an eye. He's a great director. He really knows how to frame a shot. He really knows how to set a mood. And in House of the Devil, his skills are completely on display. I swear, if you didn't know, you would think this movie was made in like 1981. It looks just like that. It looks like it was made a long time ago. And that really helps sell the movie to me in particular, because it's got a total period piece story that maybe probably was more popular then than it is now, as resulting, in the fact that this movie wasn't a huge hit. But the uh, the filming style, the retro style, the throwback style of putting it in that '80s filming style is an added layer of making it feel like you're just watching an old movie from the 1980s. A time period where the satanic panic concerns were still pretty strong. From the 70s into the early 80s, before the slasher craze really kind of took over. The devil was a big key antagonist in horror movies. You had The Exorcist and The Omen and things like that. People were really afraid of devil worshiping and possession and things like that. It stemmed from the Manson family, etc. We've talked about this in other videos. House of the Devil is part of that trend, part of that movement in horror. It's just 30 years late to the game, and that's what it feels like. It feels like you've unearthed a movie from 30 years ago that everybody forgot about, and it's fantastic. Now, again, the storyline is not the most complex. It's good, and there's a bit of a mystery to it, but quite honestly, if you know what they're going for here, if you're a horror fan, you're going to pick up on where the story's going pretty fast. I said the word satanic panic, which kind of spoils the movie a little bit for you, but you honestly, you would have known that. You just the title alone probably tips you off to that. And I don't think that's a problem. I don't think that you knowing where the movie's going, kind of seeing some of the beats, I don't think it's going to spoil the movie for you, because again, that throwback aesthetic is going to keep you locked in. If you have that kind of affinity for it, like I do, you're going to enjoy that. But also, it's just a well-made movie. Ty West knows how to ratchet up tension and mood. That's his thing. He's not a big jump scare guy. He's not a big action guy. He's a mood guy. He's a tension and dread atmosphere guy, and he crushes it. He crushes it every time. We talked about it in The Sacrament. We talked about it in the Innkeepers. And I think this one might be better than both of those movies. And that's saying a lot, because I love both those movies. But I love this movie. It's fantastic. The performances across the board are good. You might recognize some of the faces. Fun note for those of you that are Greta Gerwig fans: she's got a small role in this too, and she's fantastic in it. And I know she's known more now for her directing than her acting, but it's cute to see her show up here. But across the board, the performances are good, but it really is the direction. It's not only that throwback style, but even if they had made this in modern times, even if they had set this in a modern setting like The Innkeepers was, this movie would still be very compelling and be fantastic, and I would love it, because Ty West just really knows how to make a movie. He really knows how to do a horror film. I hope he does nothing but horror, because it's his sweet spot, and he's done such diverse horror movies, so I don't feel like he's like stuck in one lane, but he really knows how to freak me out. He really knows how to get the hairs on my arm lifting up. So I love him, and I love his movies, and I love this one here. That style, that aesthetic, is just amplified by the 1980s throwback style, that retro look. Ty West is devoted to delivering it, and he does. Again, it's a period piece, so the technology all matches 80s technology, but the camera work, the movement of the camera, the angles, it all feels dated in a good way. And it does add another layer of enjoyment for me to that movie. I clearly can't praise House of the Devil enough. I feel like not enough people are familiar with it. It feels like it doesn't get the love that it deserves. It was never the big hit. It has not become the cult classic or the bona fide classic that I feel like it should have. So I'm hoping that if you haven't seen it, you'll give it a chance and check it out, because of all the movies we're going to talk about today, it's my favorite. And it's, I think, the best, objectively the best made movie. And that's saying something, because these other movies are made extremely well. Extremely well. But this movie, I think, is fantastic. I'm pretty high on House of the Devil. If you've seen it, let us know what you think. Do you agree with me? Do you think it's an underrated film that deserves to be really trumpeted like I'm trumpeting it here? Or do you think it's okay? I'd be surprised if you hated the movie. If you did, let us know. But I'd be surprised if you hated the movie. But let us know what you think of it if you've seen it. And of course, if you haven't seen it, please check it out and come back and let me know what you think. So those are our selections for the throwback horror subgenre. But if you like these kinds of movies, if you like that aesthetic, we've got a few extra credit movies for you to check out. The first one I'm going to mention is Chillarama. And Chillarama came out in 2011, and it's an anthology movie. It actually is four separate vignettes, four separate stories with a wraparound tale, as anthologies tend to do, of people going to a drive-in that's closing down and showing like old horror movies. And each vignette is a different horror movie being shown. And what's fun about this movie is that each vignette is showing movies in a different style, a different throwback style. So you've got like the 50s monster movie style, and you've kind of got like the 60s, like Rebel Without a Cause kind of movie. There's a lot of blends going on in here that are, you got like 1930s Universal Monster style thing. Uh, they're not as well done as some of the movies we talked about on the syllabus proper. There's not the budget for it. This movie's not as high budget or highbrow, but it's got talent in there. Ray Wise shows up, Lin Shaye shows up, but the movie itself, it's different directors doing the different vignettes, and there's a lot of charm to them, but they don't quite crush it. It feels every time like a modern movie parodying these other eras rather than actually capturing those other eras. And that's a minor quibble. The movie is campy fun. I've talked before about camp movies and how when you try to do intentional camp, it kind of sometimes slides off the rails. That's a little bit the case here. It doesn't quite nail it completely. Sometimes it's trying a little bit too hard. It also ramps up a lot of the gore and graphic sex related stuff to unnecessary levels. Like, for example, I'm spoiling it a little bit here, but there's one of the tales is about a monster sperm. So you can kind of see where that's going to go with some sex jokes and stuff like that. Is it funny and entertaining? Yeah, it kind of is. It's juvenile. It's totally juvenile, but I did get a kick out of it, if I'm being honest with you. But I'm just kind of letting you know that Chillarama tries to gross you out and tries to be shocking by kind of pushing that envelope in mostly childish ways. Groin jokes and things like that. Poop jokes, things. As the movie went on, those things wore down on me more and more. The movie started out stronger and ran out of steam for me. Opinions may vary on that, but I did like the different throwbacks to the different eras, even though they were kind of more parodies than actual genuine retro style. I still appreciated it. I thought it was a lot of fun. They had like the grainy footage and stuff like that. They had the true drive-in look to the movies, and that was good. It was actually a big part of why I enjoyed the movie. I feel like without that, the movie would have gotten tiresome for me. But overall, I liked it. I thought it was kind of fun, and I'd say, if you think that sounds fun to you, if you like anthology movies, which I tend to like, I think you could do worse than this movie. It's not a long movie, and if there's any one particular vignette you don't like, it ends pretty quickly, and then you get to the next one. So yeah, I think that Chillarama worth your time. It's not a bad way to spend some time. And if you've seen it, let me know what you think of it. Did you find it off-putting? Did you find it enjoyable? Did you get bored? I started to get slightly bored towards the end, so I'm just putting that out there. But curious to see what your thoughts are on Chillarama. So if you haven't seen it, or if you wind up checking it out, let us know what you think. The next movie I'm going to talk about is called Summer of '84. And this movie came out in 2018. And it was another movie where it got a lot of buzz. And it kind of went back and forth. Like, there was a lot of buzz when it came out. Then there was kind of a little bit of a backlash buzz on it. And I didn't know whether or not people really felt like they loved it or they hated it. And it maybe kind of falls somewhere in between. And so I checked it out a little bit after the buzz died down. And I'd say I come on the side of really liking it. It was really, really good. If you're not familiar with it, it's the story of a boy who lives in a small town where a bunch of children are going missing. And he starts to suspect that his neighbor, a policeman, might be the one who is kidnapping and killing these children. And he and his friends decide to investigate and find out whether or not that's the case. And I'll stop there because I don't want to spoil it. But the movie has a lot of charm. And it's a period piece. It's set in the summer of '84. And it kind of doesn't really do like what House of the Devil did and try to film like '80s style, but it just try to kind of tap into that nostalgia aspect of it. And the best comparison I can give to you is Stranger Things. I mentioned it earlier in the video. This movie clearly is influenced by Stranger Things. Clearly. It has Stranger Things vibes right and left. It just doesn't have the supernatural sci-fi aspects to it that Stranger Things has. It's more of like a slasher. If Stranger Things was a slasher show, it would be Summer of '84. And that's not a bad thing. I like Stranger Things. I think Stranger Things is a lot of fun. Um, but I bring it up because again, it's not so much retro style as it is like retro homage. It's not really a parody because Stranger Things isn't a parody, but Stranger Things is very much like, look, it's the '80s. Look at how many '80s references we can cram into a shot. Summer of '84 is very much in the same vein. But again, I enjoy that. I think it's a lot of fun. It's very hyper real '80s. Having been a child in the '80s, having been not much different age than the kids in this movie, I can tell you it is not exactly how it was. But it feels like you kind of have like those rose colored memories. This movie is rose colored memories of 1984 for me, and I love that. I think it's great. It has a lot of charm. I think the acting is good across the board. The kids are giving good performances, and kid actors can be tough, but these ones, I don't think they're quite as good as the Stranger Things actors, but they're by no means bad by any stretch of the imagination. They have charm to them. But what else I really like about this movie is it has some guts. It's about children and everything. It's like Stranger Things, but the movie is not afraid to get really really dark at the end. The ending is incredibly bleak and dark, and it does leave room for a sequel, which I'm kind of hoping they don't do because I think that what we got was good. It was enough, and I think that that's where they should leave it. But I was really really shocked and surprised by just how dark it got because if you think about this, it's some serious subject matter: children being kidnapped, children being harmed, and usually when you see in a movie like this, that's kind of like I said, like that Stranger Things feel, you're in for more of like a fun experience, which for the most of the movie is what it's given to you. But then it likes to remind you every once in a while, no man, this really happens in real life, and this is pretty dark stuff, and I love it. I think it's great. So yeah, count me in as one of the people who really enjoyed Summer of '84, not one of the people who really kind of backlashed on it. I'm high on it. If you've seen it and you're less high on it, let us know. Or if you're as high on it as I am, let us know. But if you haven't seen it, check it out and come back and let us know what you think. And the last extra credit movie we're going to talk about today is Grindhouse. And Grindhouse is actually technically two movies kind of smushed together by two different directors. In 2007, Quentin Tarantino and Robert Rodriguez got together and released two different movies: Planet Terror by Robert Rodriguez and Death Proof by Quentin Tarantino. Both throwback movies to like the Grindhouse era of the '70s, schlocky sci-fi horror or slasher horror, and they combined them together to make one movie going experience, complete with like old commercials for concessions from like the 1970s and fake trailers for other movies, other genre Grindhouse films. And the experience is a blast. But that's the thing, the experience is the blast. The movies in and of themselves are good. They're fine. They're not amazing, although I would say, while I think Tarantino's Death Proof is probably his weakest film, it's actually much better than I remembered it. And revisiting it, it's much better than I remembered it being, and it's really still a really good movie. And Planet Terror, Rodriguez's entry, is a whole lot of fun. What's interesting about it is they both filmed in like old '70s Grindhouse style, and they scratched up their film. They really try to keep that aesthetic accurate. But the movies, both movies, are littered with modern stars, big stars that are kind of slumming it a little bit because these directors are noteworthy directors that they want to work with. So you got guys like Bruce Willis and Josh Brolin in there, Rose McGowan. There's a lot of talent in the movies. Kurt Russell, and yet these movies are supposed to be like low budget, exploitation Grindhouse flicks, and that's a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun seeing these big name actors doing like lowbrow stuff, and it's intentionally lowbrow. It's another one of those situations where they're trying to go a little bit campy, and they're pretty much nailing it. It's a little bit of parody, but they're pretty much nailing it, and I really really enjoy the movie. Like I said, the way to see this is as one big experience with the trailers in there, because the trailers are a blast. The trailers were made by other filmmakers like Edgar Wright and Rob Zombie, for example, Eli Roth, and they're a blast too. They're hilarious. They're such a hoot. They really just nail the '70s aesthetic, and frankly, you want to see those movies as well. And in the case of Robert Rodriguez, made a trailer for a movie called Machete, and he made Machete. He made that movie, and it was a blast. I would hope that they would make more of those because they are a lot of fun. I don't want to talk too much about them and spoil them for you if you haven't seen them, because And I'm telling you, if you can check out Grindhouse, and I think the Blu-ray allows you to see it all straight through. One 3+ hour experience with two movies back to back, with opening trailers, with trailers in between, and with commercials. That's the way to see it. If you can't see it that way, and you can see the individual movies, they have their merit. They're a lot of fun, but they're not as noteworthy as getting the entire experience all together. That's the way to see Grindhouse. That's the way to experience it. Honestly, the best way to see it was in the theater. Unfortunately, very few people did that. It was not a big hit. I think it was not a big hit in part because 3+ hours is a commitment, which back in that time period in 2007, it was not as common maybe as it is now to have movies that long. But also, I think people just didn't know quite what to make of it. A lot of people aren't familiar with the term grindhouse, so they didn't exactly know what it meant. So the marketing might not have been as strong as it could have been. But for whatever reason, the movie kind of petered out at the box office, which is unfortunate. So we didn't get more of these, because I feel like had it been a hit, we would have gotten a whole bunch of grindhouse style double features that had played into this trope of the throwback style, not just the movies themselves, but also the ancillary materials surrounding it, for making one big grindhouse throwback retro experience. It's a blast. If you haven't experienced that, I would definitely recommend that, because nothing in there should be terribly offensive. You may not jive with it. It may not be for you, but it's not going to be a problem. It's not going to be something that offends you or anything like that. It's just a fun ride, and I highly recommend it to anybody who hasn't checked it out. If you have thoughts on Grindhouse, of course, leave them in the comments below. But if you haven't seen it yet, take it from Professor Victor. It's a ride worth taking. Check it out. So that's going to do it for today's video on throwback horror. It's been a fun retro journey, and I've really enjoyed kind of taking a step back through time, and thinking about what these movies make me think of in terms of my childhood and my past. They tap into that nostalgia factor for me pretty well. If you're younger, maybe that won't have the same effect, but maybe it will. I don't want to speak for that, because there's a lot of young people that have an affinity for older movies and things like that. So this may hit your sweet spot, even if you are not necessarily as old as Professor Victor. Thank you very much for indulging me in looking back at these movies, and kind of my effusive praise about some of these movies. I appreciate your attendance as always, and looking forward to seeing you guys' thoughts on the comments below on this movie, or these movies, and this video. And of course, I'm looking forward to talking to you guys again next week. Until then, class dismissed.